Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you guys are having a great GSV conference and AIR show and all the good things that are happening. We have an amazing panel here to talk about a range of topics, focusing really in the absence of a comprehensive AI regulatory framework, at the federal level anyway. States are filling the void with all kinds of different ideas, most of them bright, of course, as our panelists will discuss. Some of them maybe not so, but also we're entering into a realm of a patchwork of laws and regulations and thoughts and contracts and whatnot that are creating both opportunities and risks for users and developers. So we're not going to debate whether what should be all the contours of a federal AI policy or whatever things should go into a state, but we wanted to convey, this panel wants to convey to you all what they're seeing as from policymakers, from the development, from those who think about it a lot, those who interact with policymakers in districts. I think that's what really we want to convey to folks. I wish we had a ton of time for questions, but we don't. But afterwards, everyone will be out in the hallway, so please feel free to interact. But I want to give all our panelists a couple of minutes just to have some opening remarks, and then we'll just get into a conversation and feed off of those remarks. So, Senator, please.
Well, thanks for having me here. Again, my name is Michael Lee. I'm from North Carolina. And so my perspective is probably going to be a little different than most people at the conference. So I will try and chime in on some of those things. I'm a chair of education policy and also chair of the Appropriations Committee for North Carolina. And so what that means is necessarily that policy and appropriations are really going to come through my committee and me before they kind of move out of the Senate and go over to the other chamber. And, you know, I'm not sure how much you know about kind of the regulatory environment, but most of what happens in K-12 happens at the state level. There is a federal overlay, lots of regulations, everything from privacy to IDEA and everything else, but most of it is really happening on the state level. And the tools that are utilized at the state level, AI being a tool, are all going to come through state policy and appropriations. Generally, those things will come through the General Assembly. Doesn't really matter which state you're in, even though they all have superintendents and commissioners and secretaries, some elected, some not. All that's really coming through the General Assemblies. And so as this progresses through, you're going to see states handle things remarkably different given their bent on technology, privacy, and some other things. And I'll try and kind of fill in some of that from my perspective, my state's perspective, and then some of the things I've seen as I've traveled.
Thank you. I'm Mary Strain. I lead AI strategy for education for AWS. My main usefulness is that I spend all day, every day, talking to education technology firms, higher education leadership, K-12 leadership, and I learn about what they're concerned about. I learned what use cases they're thinking about and mostly how they are looking to adopt this technology. So it's just a tremendous opportunity to learn from those leaders. I think when we think about the emerging regulatory environment, we also have to think about how organizations can best prepare, both on the K-12 side, but also educational technology firms. And that, to me, really what I'm hearing a lot about is sort of flexibility, a flexible architecture technically, so that they're able to adopt new capabilities, but also thinking about the long-term impact of some of the technologies that are coming about. So I did want to tell a very quick story. So I was asked to give a talk in the state of Connecticut, and the person who preceded me was incredibly dynamic, very smart, great videos, and I was very mad because I wasn't going to have any of that. But one of the things he showed was a deepfake video that he had created of Henry VIII. And it was an opportunity for students to use artificial intelligence to speak directly to Henry VIII. He was from England, and it was for students in the UK, basically high school age, and how wonderful this was. And everybody was, this is amazing, this is terrific. And the question that he asked was about Catherine of Aragon, who many of you may know he had murdered. So the question was about, why did you murder Catherine of Aragon? And he gave his perspective. And I sat back and I thought, well, who's telling Catherine of Aragon's story here? Right? So when we think about these large language models and the capabilities and the potentiality, I think we have to think about how we as public serving individuals think about perpetuating the existing bias in these models and how we can use technology to impact that, how we can change that. Maybe we do our own foundation models. Maybe we have a marketplace of models that we're able to access to have a more diverse perspective. So I just wanted to highlight that story because I think it's fun. But
Hi, everyone. My name is Christina Ishmael. My pronouns are she and her. Up until the end of 2023, I was the leader of the Office of Ed Tech at the U.S. Department of Education. I also was the face of AI in education for your country. You're welcome. When Secretary Cardona said, "You get to do that," I was like, cool. Please don't overpromise. Please, 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 please. No, but if you have had the chance to read the Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Teaching and Learning report from the U.S. Department of Education, that's the product of our office. I am no longer there, and so I serve as a strategic advisor for a lot of different nonprofits and folks that are really wrestling with AI policy, whether it's at the state level. I'm a former state ed tech director for the state of Nebraska, so it's been really interesting to see how states are figuring this all out, or if it is more at the district level and even multi-district level, and working with colleagues like Stacy at NEA and trying to figure out what this means for contracts, for collective bargaining agreements, and then for crisis communications. I just learned yesterday that Beverly Hills had to expel some students because they used an AI tool that created nudes of their peers. And this is something that we have not talked about at all. But speaking of a risk, we're going to need a crisis plan there. So, these are the things that I get to plug into and continue to work with folks like Pat to stay abreast of all of the things that are happening nationally. And then, of course, also supporting the international work as well, because the EU has already passed their AI Act. We have a lot to learn from them to see if that's even possible within the federal kind of space here, but also recognizing the power of the states and then, of course, the local level. So I'm excited to be here and joining this conversation.
Hey all, my name is Pat Yon-Pradit. I'm the Chief Academic Officer of Code.org and the lead of Teach AI. Teach AI is an initiative led by Code.org, ETS, ISTE, Khan Academy, and the World Economic Forum. It's dedicated to guiding education leaders and policymakers during this opportunity that we have, and we need to make the most of that opportunity. What you should know is that my role in this big AI and education ecosystem is to create the enabling conditions for education leaders and policymakers to make responsible decisions. And so we're releasing this policy resource tomorrow with the help of folks like Stacy from the National Education Association, as well as lots of other education policy acronym organizations in the US and abroad. And it's geared towards 5 key policy recommendations, very obvious ones, folks. So not like the tech governance stuff that we might be talking about now, things like create an AI and education task force, promote AI literacy, provide state-level guidance, build capacity through professional development for all staff, and support innovation through R&D. So we'll be talking about that later.
I appreciate all of these remarks. I'm thinking about, when we talk about AI regulation, are we using the right word, right? Regulation, regulatory, connotes control, right? Contours, guide rails. There was a state senator here in California from just up the road talking about how states need to fill in the void, right? But that, of course, like the other side of the story, means that there is a void. So are we using the right term when we talk about the need for AI regulation?
Well, I mean, gosh, that's a really broad topic. I'm going to speak to just kind of the education piece, and because you can talk about things like libel and slander and how all that plays into with deepfakes and other things. But just in the context of education, I don't know that it's really regulation more than it is policy. And AI is, and I'm going to make a statement that people think I'm crazy, but it's not a lot different than other tools. I mean, it's another tool that we are going to utilize, hopefully, to take what our goals are and move them forward. Our Superintendent Truitt has been kind of on the front lines of all this and establishing statewide guidance. That guidance is aligned not just to AI, but how AI plays with the goals that we have as a state, whether it's the portrait of a graduate or some of the other things that are going on. So guidance and policy is really what I would think about it more in the context of, and then from a policy perspective, how we can help our state and our districts and our schools be kind of on the front lines of this technology, because we are in a competition with other states and the rest of the world. We can't keep up with the speed of business, let alone the speed of innovation. So we've really got to figure some things out as a state, and I know a lot of other states are looking at the same thing.
Yeah, so I think regulation is a really interesting word to use in this case. There has been interest, I will say, from folks at the U.S. Department of Education in kind of talking about it and regulating similar to how healthcare has their own regulation. And it's really for student data privacy and for, cybersecurity purposes and all of this. I don't know if there's going to be movement, honestly, just because of everything else that Congress is dealing with right now. I don't know. And so this is why we continue to have folks like Teach AI, like the EdSafe AI Alliance, who are composed of these kind of national organizations that can push on this a little bit more from the outside. And so we are part of these conversations, of course, but I don't know if we will actually have any sort of formal regulation.
I don't think we will, Christina.
Okay,
so I'm on the, so I do a little bit of the federal briefing work. I wouldn't call it advocacy because there isn't a particular policy or something that we're advocating for. I asked these staffers, so like, what's the temperature for potential regulation? They're saying we're way far from that. We're still in learning mode. So all these like private hearings, public hearings and all that, that's still just, that's gonna go on for a while.
Yeah.
And I think that we're still gonna be far away from it. Sorry folks, the whole privacy issue, the whole every state has their own privacy agreements and districts and all that, you're gonna see the same thing with AI. Just get ready for it.
I just want to, sorry, I have a cold. I just want to comment from a technology perspective, because I do think when we think about how do we prepare from a technology perspective, we are at the infancy of this technology, and we're not even at coffee hour yet. And so I think about regulations, policies, and organizations that are in this room right now is sort of how do I adapt? How do I have a flexible enough architecture that could take advantage of the new capabilities that'll be available at the end of this session, and that will be part of the regulatory or policy environment going forward. So I do think that that's an important thing to touch on, is sort of how is our technical architecture flexible enough to meet these mandates as they evolve and change, and from state to state, community to community, nation to nation.
Yeah, and as a country, we still haven't figured out the whole social media thing. And so, to say we're going to move here as a country is really, it's just not going to happen. So I think what we're going to see is states really taking a much more active role, just like states have started to try and take a more active role with devices, social media, and things like that. And so, from a policymaker's perspective, I hear from ed tech vendors all the time. And so as we move into the advent of AI, though, it's going to be very different. It's not like you can run a pilot with a particular technology, see how it works, get a report back. It's so much deeper than that. The scale is so much larger, and the exposure is so much more imminent with machine learning, generative AI, and a lot of things that are going on. So I think you're going to see states take a very proactive role in working with vendors, trust but verify, but really, really working with vendors that have been out there for a while, that what their motives are, and they've got a track record. And so I think you're going to see that.
And picking up on that thread, that it seems like the conversations around policy and ed tech are the same. The technology is the thing that changes, right? The conversations kind of really don't. Yeah. Maybe this is a little bit different because there's a speed element here, but when we kind of carrying on the theme of vernacular and words, like what are, from either your former role on the federal side, also former Department of Ed alum, so love that. But
we'll have drinks later.
How should the AI and education stakeholders be communicating to policy? Like what are the words do you think that resonate the most, either from the public sector side, or what are some of the concepts that we don't? Because sometimes founders think differently than policymakers, and that's okay. I think, as a former policymaker, I like when founders think about the things, and we have to use different words and whatnot. But there can be a bit of a disconnect, I think.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is, if you notice the title of this session, what's the word? risks, right? So here's a fun little story. I was told that I was overly optimistic about AI in education from my colleagues at the White House. It's really fun. And so we very intentionally in the AI report used the phrase opportunities and risks, because in education, we are trying to change the deficit language that we use, especially with students with disabilities and multilingual learners, to asset-based language. And so we didn't want to say risks and opportunities. Yes, we are very well aware that there are risks out there. In fact, there are risks that we don't yet know. But the more we can lead with that, the positive side and the assets, then we can certainly say opportunities and risks. The other part of all of this is a lot of you are tech folk, correct? Yes? I mean, I see some of my educator friends in here. But the language that we use matters. And so I talk really openly about my own mental health, that I am neurodivergent. I was late diagnosed just as an adult a couple of years ago. I have ADHD. Clearly, I'm really struggling to sit here. And I taught early childhood, in case you couldn't tell. But it is really important that we are using the right language. So in the tech space right now, when there is an error in generative AI, it's called a hallucination. What we're hearing from medical practitioners in the mental health space is that we should not be flippantly using words that are associated with actual mental health crises. We shouldn't be calling it hallucination. So then we should be calling it a mistake, an error. And then there's like gravity to each of these words that we choose to use. And so what does that look like as far as guidance or policy? Like we want folks to be able to understand that. And so that takes going back to the AI literacy, talking about this, having these conversations. And so I think, again, asset-based language, we want to start with opportunities and risks, fully recognizing that there are risks, but also making sure that we're using language that is not harmful to people as well.
Let me give another reason why we should try to stray away from words like hallucination. That was a very valid reason. Yeah. An educative reason is that when a kid hears hallucination, they think this thing is thinking like a human and can hallucinate. Yes. And I know Christina's talked about this a lot, and there have been articles. Our colleague, Dr. Patty Ruiz, has written an article about this. You can Google it. But what it does is it anthropomorphizes it, yep, turns it into either a human or a magic box or something like that it isn't, and that causes a cascade of other misconceptions as well. So as a former teacher who taught for 13 years, you know, I'm thinking about the effect of these terms on kids' conceptions and thus the decisions that they make moving forward.
Not to mention a deep fake of Henry VIII that you can talk to, right? But I also just want to talk about the asset base from a use case perspective, because I do hear a lot of exciting use cases in education that I think, you know, we typically think of this as sort of a robot overlord, replacing teachers, replacing educators. But what I'm seeing, I like to call it boring AI, which is the AI that's used to sort of demystify institutional processes, yes, you know, opaque processes that have caused tremendous amount of friction, particularly for students who struggle the most in school. So the idea of, you know, creating frictionless processes for financial aid services or housing applications or even registering for kindergarten. There are 20 individual PDFs required to register for kindergarten in New York City, and there were 68,000 applications last year. And they all get sent in and they all get keyed in. So again, it's these sort of efficiency and sort of ways that we can reduce affective filters that I think a lot of policymakers aren't dialing in on in terms of use cases that are really incredibly helpful for constituents to engage in processes that have been traditionally opaque.
I have a real example. Sorry, Senator. There's a real example of what Mary was just talking about. LAUSD, you might have heard about it, releases this thing called ED. Mm-hmm. So what ED does is it makes less opaque the world of services, yep, that the school district of 400,000 plus students, yep, can provide to families and increases family engagement. So that's just a real-world example. Mm-hmm.
So, and what I think you're going to find is that the way we fund education is going to fundamentally change in the United States.
So you all heard it here first. Ready, right? You heard it here first.
I mean, so right now, I mean, there's clearly been a movement in the education world. I realize we're at a more of a technology conference, but to move away from the Carnegie unit, you know, time being a proxy for learning. And so what you're going to see with generative AI is it's going to accelerate that process. And so you're going to find more competency-based learning instead of having, you know, seat time. That is how we fund education in the United States, whether you're getting credits at the at the college or your ADM, average daily membership in your schools. And as you see a lot of these states move to weighted student formulas, some already there, and then you're also seeing the vouchers and things like that, you're going to start seeing, I think, a lot of these states, to the extent they're not already on a weighted student formula, they're going to get there, and then they're going to have essentially endorsed vendors that can be utilized for different school systems. And you're going to see parents and families have much more agency when it comes to the technology that their children are using. So this is going to be a fundamental change. In North Carolina, the state provides 62% of every dollar. The the federal government's at 10 cents of every dollar, and the balance is coming from the locals. Average is 45 state, 45 local, 10% of feds. But all those dollars are going to start moving differently. You're going to start seeing workforce dollars on the federal level moving into K-12 because you're going to see a lot more workforce in what we now call 10th, 11th, 12th grade. We're really going to be talking about age bands at that point. But this is going to accelerate a movement that has been trying to push forward for quite some time.
You know, we often hear about AI education policy from the student perspective. How do you think it fits with the teacher perspective? Can these AI tools make good teachers better? Make not as good, not in a pejorative sense, but just in a way to, you know, demarcate one from the other, better, improvement, right? Teachers under a lot of pressure to perform, either coming from the states, coming from the feds, whatnot. Is there room in the AI policy conversation for that?
I can share a use case in New York City where they are using AI to look at teacher evaluation, classroom lessons, videos, also their teacher evaluation forms. Again, it's in some ways a boring AI project because you're using the data from that to just gain new insights, so you're able to curate a little bit more of the professional development that you offer to teachers. In New York City, the professional development budget is massive. This is an opportunity, I think, both for efficiency and to provide hyper-personalized, real-time feedback to teachers that could improve student achievement significantly. So I think that's a great example to start thinking about, sort of, again, a combination of boring AI, but having real impact.
I want to talk about risk. I mean, there's risk. I forgot what the title is, but there's risk in the title. So we should talk about risk, even though I'm actually like Christina, and that I'd like to talk more about the opportunities. But so this is a very realistic risk, folks. I'm going to assume that there are at least 25% of this crowd that's involved in some type of AI, ed tech, something, right? Now, let's say you're successful, and like very successful. You might still be successful in the traditional box of education, meaning you close achievement gaps. That's awesome. Yeah. That is awesome. But what happens is that we miss the opportunity for really shifting education the way that the senator was talking about. And so we just do current education really well, but current education might not be the thing that we really need in an age of AI. So just think about that. Like, that's assuming, like, ideally that your work actually works out very well. Ask yourself, actually, how transformational is it?
In a sense, Pat, picking up on that, it's like, begs the question, do we need a new set of AI laws? Do we need specificity around AI education, or do we have it more of a dovetail conversation with AI plugging into existing conversations within education as it moves along its own spectrum?
Yeah. I mean, everyone has good ideas in education. Senator Lee has great ideas in education. Mary does, Christina does, you do as well. And the thing is, these been around for decades. Competency-based education, project-based learning, active learning, flipped classroom, if you want to help education folks, think about those things that need a turbocharger and create an AI solution for those things, because those things are things that are evidence-based, that people already want, that are just super hard to do.
I agree, absolutely. But I do think that there is room for policy when we think about the potentialities of negative impact. I worked in big urban school systems my whole life, and lots of students who got the worst ed tech, wrote, running through standardized test forms, were students who were the least, resourced. And so I think about a concern is, do we give ed tech capabilities to students in least resources communities because it's cheaper, it's faster, and it's not as effective? And if we don't have good policy around evaluating the impact of that, or even how it was built and the downstream impact, it will perpetuate the existing inequity.
Yeah, and I think you're going to see that from a lot of states, because this gives us the ability to reach a lot of students that it just was difficult at scale to do previously. And, education is the weirdest industry on the planet. I mean, it's impossible to change. We're not really doing it different than when my mom was in school. And it's been just very difficult. The data we get is usually 2 years old. And so this is really going to change everything. And for the ed tech folks out there, if you're designing systems based on the way we do things today, you're not going to be very successful. And I can look at one person in this room that's designing an education system that's wholly different than anything else that's going on, and they're going to be, shoot a plug, Tuesday night, the Innovation Showcase, they're going to be there from North Carolina. And so, I do think that generative AI is not going to change everything, but it will give the ability for all of these tools and techniques to really move forward in a very lightning fast way.
And for a more tangible thing, I think for folks that want to think of something like actionable right now is looking at your policies that already exist. So the majority of the pushback right away, or the fear on generative AI, has been around plagiarism. If I hear that one more time, I'm just kidding. But that's what it's been, that's what's happening. So looking at acceptable use policies and or responsible use policies, whatever you already have on the books in your school systems, as well as academic integrity policies. Those are usually included in your student handbooks, like whatever. Kids have to sign these things. Let's not start from scratch. Let's start to think about how Gen AI or more specific types of AI tools can be used with the existing policies. So I think at that very granular local level, I know Michelle's working on this in St. Vrain Valley in Colorado, where they are working with what they already had and then starting to incorporate how these newer tools are starting to do that. And emerging technologies will continue to emerge. This is not the end point. And so how do you think of using what you already have on your books and then starting to just kind of work it from there?
And it makes me think that, there have been a lot of serious and hard conversations around education policy writ large, K-12, post-secondary, whatnot. And also, from a policymaker perspective, and those who communicate with policymakers, and now we've got a room full of stakeholders. Congratulations, you all earn your AI education policy stakeholder badge.
We write at dawn.
That's right. It strikes me that when we talk about inequities in education, AI can be an accelerant, maybe. It can also be an assistant in bridging that gap. True, not true? How can our stakeholder friends communicate that to policymakers and help prevent that? Because it seems like different school districts are going to use AI for different. You just can't deploy a tool in a high-performing school district in the same way you can in a less high-performing. And again, correct me if I'm wrong. As a moderator, I get to do that, right? I can just say things and they can correct me if I'm wrong. But I just want to make sure, it feels to me like that could be something that drives not just regulation, but a significant component of AI policy with respect to education. Pat?
Actually, you shouldn't start with me, because Christina, as part of her latter part of your time, started or mostly got all the way through the National Education Technology Plan, which talks about 3 digital divides. We all know the access connectivity issue, but Christina is going to enlighten us and talk about 2 other divides.
Thanks, Pat. That was really good. Thanks. So the National
Practiced all of this.
I know, right? I know. Yeah, exactly. National Ed Tech Plan, if you're not familiar with it, is the flagship publication that comes out of the Office of Ed Tech. In fact, that's the reason why this office was created in 1996 by Congress. They knew that technology was going to impact education. They created this office to put out this flagship publication every couple of years to kind of really assess what's happening in the industry, and then how do they think of ed tech moving forward. So the previous version is from 2017, really looking at kind of 5 domains within education. This was a shift. Obviously, we learned a few things in the pandemic, and really looking at those 3 divides. So there is the digital access divide, that is broadband connectivity, any of like devices, also accessible instructional materials. Those are like access to those things. Then there's the digital use divide, which was also called out in the 2017 version. You were just talking about that passive kind of consumption. In some of our highest need schools, we put technology in there and it's for rote things. It's for interventions. They go sit on a computer for 45 minutes. So boring, so boring. So how can we move that to active use of technology? And what's missing in the middle is the digital design divide. And so it's providing that ample time, professional learning, ongoing coaching, talking about universal design for learning. When we design for students on the margins, we are designing for everyone. Everyone benefits from it. And so those three divides are already very, very apparent. And we do have a potential, a risk, if we want to go there, of by using AI, and more particularly generative AI, ones that that cost money versus the free versions, we will potentially run into another divide here.
I just want that, thank you. I think that's exactly true. But I also want to highlight, we did some work, AWS, with the Council of Great City Schools, EDUCAUSE recently releasing some generative AI guidance to their constituents. And one of the things I think we need to look at is the technology too, because it isn't just about the use case, it's about sort of how the sausage was made and making that utterly transparent to consumers. And so when I think about school districts or colleges and universities or even public sector institutions purchasing capabilities, there is a increasing demand to have sort of exposure. What language models were used? What was the capabilities? What were the AI services? How was the data used? How was the data not used? And so I do think from a technical perspective, it's important that we educate both the educational technology companies themselves and also their consumers, but also public policy holders about what the actual technical background is here, what's happening under the hood, so that we can hold people accountable across that entire value chain.
Yeah, and as policymakers, we're going to be looking at the walled garden that you've created, and trust but verify. To the extent that we're able to as policymakers, and we'll have the agencies that are kind of on the day-to-day really looking into some of those issues. When it comes to the inequities in with regard to technology, whether it's AI or what we're experiencing around our country now, I mean, it really is the policy that's in place today and the policymakers moving forward. Does AI have the ability to broaden that divide? Maybe. But the policymakers that are there, it's either there or not, and they're either fixing it or not. I don't know that AI is going to make it better or worse. You do have a lot of states that are trying really hard to figure out the scalability of certain technologies to get to certain parts of maybe their geographically remote areas or inner city areas that they've had a difficult time with the local. A lot of times, education is very local centric, and things go on a local level that we as state policymakers can try and move the needle on, but sometimes it's really going to come down to that local board or those local officials.
Yeah. I just want to give a shout out to something that Senator Lee talked about. So North Carolina is the 4th state in the U.S. to provide AI guidance. And there are now 9 states that are going to be 10 actually very soon. But North Carolina's so I was just on a panel with Superintendent Truitt right before this. That's why I was rushing from the convention center. And she gave us the story as to how the guidance came about. She said that when ChatGPT got released, there was a large district in North Carolina that banned it. And immediately the state was like, whoa, this is going to create quite some inequities, around, across all the different districts with folks banning it, not banning it, and this and that. Well, we need to provide some guidance at the state level. And I love how they didn't start with, what do we do about regulations? They thought, what's some light, instructional, flexible guidance that they're already iterating on and all that we can get out in front and make sure that folks it's not a wild west of AI implementations out there. So, we were talking about regulation, but I mean, examples like that are what's happening right now in state departments of education guidance.
I just want to also dial in on another risk, and I think should be part of a policy discussion. But when we think about all of the amazing use cases everybody in here is building for and everybody is even thinking about consuming, we need to think about the cost, right? and the compute infrastructure and the environmental impact
you.
of running millions and millions and millions of API calls to 300 billion parameters. There are lots of foundation models that are incredibly performant, that are much smaller, and so I would just encourage legislatures and others to consider an infrastructure that allows you the flexibility to consider the long-term cost and impact of any generative AI use case that you deploy potentially to millions of consumers.
We're coming up on 5 minutes, and I want to close with kind of where we're going to be in a little bit. But hopefully, you know, what you all are taking away from this conversation are the multiple facets that goes into creating AI education policy. It's not as easy as I think folks make it out to be. I think the patchwork in state laws, you're seeing it manifest itself in very difficult and challenging conversations that are from, you know, legacy inequities to environmental things. So when folks are communicating to policymakers, I think it is sensible policy to think about all of what you're seeing out there, reports, how other states are doing it, and being able to use the right vernacular, use the right words. All right, so in closing, because they want us to have, and you know, kind of here comes the sun, what happens next? Jan.
Overly optimistic.
That's right. So we're reconvening this august panel in a year.
Okay.
What are we going to see when it comes to, now we've taken off this like macro AI education Uber law. That's gone. What are we going to see at the state level, and then what do we think we're going to see elsewhere? I'll start, we'll go down the line and just to keep it easy.
Oh, I'm first.
Yes, he's first. Always go with the electeds, right?
So I think what you're going to see in North Carolina, how about that? I think you're going to see a relatively broad-based pilot utilizing generative AI technology in probably 6th through 12th grade. You're probably going to see another pilot that takes AI technology in the middle schools that's partnered with other innovations, maybe in 6 to 8 of those schools. So I think you're going to see some really good pilots and evidence coming back on a relatively broad statewide level and a cross-section of communities, both rural and urban, probably moving more into some of the rural areas than the urban areas in the beginning.
I think you're going to start to see a market for generative AI capabilities in ed tech that I haven't quite, seen quite yet. I mean, there's a demand moving in measurable ways. I also think things are going to be way cheaper and easier to build and faster. And so that, again, having that flexible architecture allows you to keep pace with that level of innovation on the back end of these solutions.
This Friday, on the 19th, we are celebrating National AI Literacy Day. If you did not know, it is a thing. I think that we are going to continue to have some national pushes on the need for AI literacy that is tied to all the things that we do across the curriculum. And, thinking about how younger students, my former students, wouldn't necessarily be able to use many of the tools right now because they were under the age of 13. So if they can't use the model themselves, I'm going to use it myself and model how to do it as the teacher, but also have the conversations. You'd be surprised at what kindergartners can talk about, y'all. 5-year-olds, they know. They are so curious. They love asking questions. Great, let's ask questions. And so we need to start those conversations now around AI literacy, and I want to see that continue to grow because that is going to help us make better choices as far as these tools and potential policy.
Yeah. And so if events like National AI Literacy Day or these policy resources that Teach AI is launching tomorrow are disseminated well enough and picked up well enough, what we're going to see is a fertile environment where more and more of our population are smarter consumers of AI. And that's actually a good thing for you all because you want a smarter ecosystem where they're asking the right questions. It's going to drive us more towards responsible development, responsible implementation. It's going to put money in your pockets. I mean, that's a good thing, I assume. But most of all, it's going to lead us towards that transformation that we're talking about versus just kind of replicating the same old with ed tech.
What that sounds like to me is it's optimism, right? We're all optimistic, right? please join me in thanking the panelists. Everyone has questions. Folks will be outside. Please.
Thank you.